They came from 3 different streets, 3 different worlds, and built an empire on silence. Joe Masseria, the boss of bosses who ruled Manhattan like a battlefield and ate his last meal beside betrayal. Joe Bonanno, the gentleman Don who carried the old code across an ocean and watched it die in his own bloodline. And Tony Accardo, the big Tuna who learned from Capone that the only safe man is the one no one remembers. For half a century their shadows moved through America's backrooms, shaping cities, bending laws, deciding who woke up and who didn't. They built fortunes, burned friends, and outlived every bullet meant for them. But every kingdom ends the same way. In a whisper. In the dark. With no one left to listen. So tonight, as the rain falls over New York and Chicago, close your eyes. Let the noise fade. Let the ghosts speak. This is the story of 3 kings who ruled the night, and the silence that outlived them all. The night it began, the wind from the sea carried the smell of smoke up through the olive groves of Castellamare del Golfo. The hills glowed faintly under a bruised sky, and the stars vanished behind the gray breath of burning fields. Inside a small stone farmhouse, a boy named Giuseppe Bonanno woke to the crackle of wood and the trembling of his mother's voice. He was 9 years old, barefoot, and still half asleep when he stepped to the window and saw the world turning red. Down the slope, the family's vineyard was on fire. The flames spread in low waves, licking the black vines that his father had tended all spring. The stable was already gone. The mule screamed once and then the sound stopped. Men moved in the darkness, their silhouettes broken by the light of torches. Giuseppe's father, a tall man with hands hardened by the soil, stood by the door with a shotgun. He said nothing. His wife crossed herself and whispered a prayer, her eyes reflecting the fire like 2 small mirrors. No one asked who had done it. In Sicily one never asked. When the fire reached the stone wall at the edge of their property, the men disappeared. Only the smoke remained, curling into the valley like a warning. The elder Bonanno lowered his gun, his face gray with ash and something deeper, resignation. He turned to his son, who watched him silently, and said in a voice that was more command than comfort, "Remember this, boy. When a man cannot defend his bread, he does not deserve to eat it." Then he walked out into the ruined fields, leaving the boy to watch the horizon darken again. Giuseppe did not sleep for the rest of the night. He sat on the floor beside the cold hearth and listened to the sound of rain beginning to fall on the roof. It hissed as it touched the embers outside, as if the sky itself wanted to erase what had happened but lacked the strength. By dawn, only a thin smoke remained over the vineyard. His father was gone to speak with someone in town. His mother packed what little could be saved, clothes, a crucifix, a photograph of her wedding day, and told the boy to keep quiet. Silence, she said, was safer than truth. That winter the family sold the last of their land. By spring Giuseppe's father was dead, shot by men who were never named in court and never needed to be. His mother took him to Palermo, where she cleaned houses for families who paid her with bread and pity. The boy worked at the docks, carrying crates of citrus bound for the north. Each time a ship left the harbor, he felt something inside him lean toward it. At night, when he looked across the black water, he thought of the men who had burned his life down and of the strange place beyond the sea where they said a man could become anything. In 1908, when he was 15, he boarded a cargo steamer bound for New York. The ship's hull smelled of rust and salt, and the air inside the lower decks was thick with sickness. Families huddled around trunks that held all they owned, photographs, bread, dried figs, the last traces of home. Giuseppe lay awake each night listening to the ocean hammer the ship. He told himself that he was leaving the smoke behind. He told himself that America would be clean. When the Statue of Liberty appeared through the fog, most of the passengers wept. Giuseppe did not. He simply stared at the city beyond the harbor, a tangle of stone and noise that seemed to breathe on its own, and felt a calm settle over him. Everything ahead was unknown, but at least it was new. Brooklyn in those years was a map of hunger. The streets were lined with pushcarts and shouting men. The air smelled of coal smoke, garlic, and laundry soap. Immigrant families crowded into tenements where the walls sweated in summer and froze in winter. The boy learned English by listening, by imitating the shopkeepers and the dock workers who barked orders in every language of Europe. He learned when to smile and when to disappear. At 14, he found work in a bakery on Grand Street. Each morning before dawn, he shoveled coal into the oven until his face turned black with soot. Flour dust clung to his hair like frost. Yet behind the scent of bread and yeast, another smell lingered, the faint sweetness of wine and cigar smoke from the men who gathered in the back room after closing. They spoke softly in dialect, their voices steady and deliberate. When the boy carried a tray of pastries to them, they would pause and glance up, measuring him with the same cold precision that his father once used when inspecting a vine. He did not understand their words at first, but he understood their silence. It was the same silence that ruled Sicily, the kind that needed no witnesses. He began to recognize the faces that appeared in the bakery each week. A butcher, a tailor, a man who ran a small grocery nearby. They met after dark, never wrote anything down and always left together. When one of them disappeared for a few days, the others spoke of him in the past tense. Giuseppe, now calling himself Joe, never asked questions. He worked, watched, and remembered. By 17 he had learned how to move through the city without being noticed, how to shake a hand and keep an eye on the other one, how to hold his temper like a coin that might one day buy something important. New York was changing. Prohibition was only a few years away. The docks hummed with rumor. Crates marked olive oil and vinegar carried something heavier inside. Police raids became common, but so did new fortunes. Joe saw boys younger than him wearing silk ties and driving cars paid for by invisible money. He kept baking bread, but the smell of whiskey had already replaced the smell of flour in his dreams. Sometimes, late at night, he would climb to the roof of his tenement and look at the lights across the East River. He would think of the words his father had said long ago, about defending one's bread, and wonder whether America was any different. Down below, the city never slept. Somewhere in those streets, he sensed a ladder waiting in the dark. All he had to do was take the first step. And as the wind carried the faintest hint of smoke from the factories along the waterfront, Joe Bonanno closed his eyes and promised himself that next time, the fire would belong to him. The night it began, the wind from the sea carried the smell of smoke up through the olive groves of Castellamare del Golfo. The hills glowed faintly under a bruised sky, and the stars vanished behind the gray breath of burning fields. Inside a small stone farmhouse, a boy named Giuseppe Bonanno woke to the crackle of wood and the trembling of his mother's voice. He was 9 years old, barefoot, and still half asleep when he stepped to the window and saw the world turning red. Down the slope, the family's vineyard was on fire. The flames spread in low waves, licking the black vines that his father had tended all spring. The stable was already gone. The mule screamed once and then the sound stopped. Men moved in the darkness, their silhouettes broken by the light of torches. Giuseppe's father, a tall man with hands hardened by the soil, stood by the door with a shotgun. He said nothing. His wife crossed herself and whispered a prayer, her eyes reflecting the fire like two small mirrors. No one asked who had done it. In Sicily, one never asked. When the fire reached the stone wall at the edge of their property, the men disappeared. Only the smoke remained, curling into the valley like a warning. The elder Bonanno lowered his gun, his face gray with ash and something deeper, resignation. He turned to his son, who watched him silently, and said in a voice that was more command than comfort, "Remember this, boy. When a man cannot defend his bread, he does not deserve to eat it." Then he walked out into the ruined fields, leaving the boy to watch the horizon darken again. Giuseppe did not sleep for the rest of the night. He sat on the floor beside the cold hearth and listened to the sound of rain beginning to fall on the roof. It hissed as it touched the embers outside, as if the sky itself wanted to erase what had happened but lacked the strength. By dawn, only a thin smoke remained over the vineyard. His father was gone to speak with someone in town. His mother packed what little could be saved, clothes, a crucifix, a photograph of her wedding day, and told the boy to keep quiet. Silence, she said, was safer than truth. That winter the family sold the last of their land. By spring Giuseppe's father was dead, shot by men who were never named in court and never needed to be. His mother took him to Palermo, where she cleaned houses for families who paid her with bread and pity. The boy worked at the docks, carrying crates of citrus bound for the north. Each time a ship left the harbor, he felt something inside him lean toward it. At night, when he looked across the black water, he thought of the men who had burned his life down and of the strange place beyond the sea where they said a man could become anything. In 1908, when he was 15, he boarded a cargo steamer bound for New York. The ship's hull smelled of rust and salt, and the air inside the lower decks was thick with sickness. Families huddled around trunks that held all they owned, photographs, bread, dried figs, the last traces of home. Giuseppe lay awake each night listening to the ocean hammer the ship. He told himself that he was leaving the smoke behind. He told himself that America would be clean. When the Statue of Liberty appeared through the fog, most of the passengers wept. Giuseppe did not. He simply stared at the city beyond the harbor, a tangle of stone and noise that seemed to breathe on its own, and felt a calm settle over him. Everything ahead was unknown, but at least it was new. Brooklyn in those years was a map of hunger. The streets were lined with pushcarts and shouting men. The air smelled of coal smoke, garlic, and laundry soap. Immigrant families crowded into tenements where the walls sweated in summer and froze in winter. The boy learned English by listening, by imitating the shopkeepers and the dock workers who barked orders in every language of Europe. He learned when to smile and when to disappear. At 14 he found work in a bakery on Grand Street. Each morning before dawn, he shoveled coal into the oven until his face turned black with soot. Flour dust clung to his hair like frost. Yet behind the scent of bread and yeast, another smell lingered, the faint sweetness of wine and cigar smoke from the men who gathered in the back room after closing. They spoke softly in dialect, their voices steady and deliberate. When the boy carried a tray of pastries to them, they would pause and glance up, measuring him with the same cold precision that his father once used when inspecting a vine. He did not understand their words at first, but he understood their silence. It was the same silence that ruled Sicily, the kind that needed no witnesses. He began to recognize the faces that appeared in the bakery each week. A butcher, a tailor, a man who ran a small grocery nearby. They met after dark, never wrote anything down, and always left together. When one of them disappeared for a few days, the others spoke of him in the past tense. Giuseppe, now calling himself Joe, never asked questions. He worked, watched, and remembered. By 17 he had learned how to move through the city without being noticed, how to shake a hand and keep an eye on the other one, how to hold his temper like a coin that might one day buy something important. New York was changing. Prohibition was only a few years away. The docks hummed with rumor. Crates marked olive oil and vinegar carried something heavier inside. Police raids became common, but so did new fortunes. Joe saw boys younger than him wearing silk ties and driving cars paid for by invisible money. He kept baking bread, but the smell of whiskey had already replaced the smell of flour in his dreams. Sometimes, late at night, he would climb to the roof of his tenement and look at the lights across the East River. He would think of the words his father had said long ago, about defending one's bread, and wonder whether America was any different. Down below, the city never slept. Somewhere in those streets, he sensed a ladder waiting in the dark. All he had to do was take the first step. And as the wind carried the faintest hint of smoke from the factories along the waterfront, Joe Bonanno closed his eyes and promised himself that next time, the fire would belong to him. By the winter of 1920, New York had grown bold and corrupt enough to make saints blush. Prohibition had turned whiskey into gold and ordinary men into gangsters. In the speakeasies behind shuttered doors, politicians drank beside priests, and policemen drank beside thieves. Cash flowed like the illegal liquor that fueled it. And standing at the top of it all, wearing a tailored gray suit and a smile sharper than a blade, was Joe the boss Masseria. Masseria had not been born powerful. He came from Sicily like the rest of them, born poor, hard, and suspicious of everyone. But where others carried fear across the ocean, he brought hunger. In America, he discovered that violence could be organized, loyalty could be purchased, and silence could be law. Within 10 years of arriving, he had turned the Lower East Side into his personal kingdom. Bakers, barbers, and butchers paid him for protection, and when they didn't, their windows shattered and their stores caught fire. He called it business. Everyone else called it survival. On a gray morning in 1921, Joe Bonanno delivered bread to a small restaurant on Spring Street. The sign above the door read La Stella Rosa. He had been told to leave the loaves in the back, but curiosity drew him inside. The air smelled of smoke, meat, and something metallic, gun oil perhaps. 4 men sat around a table, their heads bent together. One of them looked up and met Joe's eyes. He was a large man with a heavy face and a diamond pin glinting from his tie. His expression was calm, but his gaze carried the weight of command. It was Masseria. "Who are you, kid?" the man asked in thickly accented English. "Just the baker's boy," Joe answered. His hands were steady. He had learned long ago that fear was a scent. Masseria studied him for a moment, then nodded. "A boy who works is a boy who lives. Remember that." Joe nodded and left the bread on the counter. As he walked back into the cold, he could feel the man's eyes following him. Something about that gaze stayed with him for years, the way it assessed him not as a person but as a tool waiting to be shaped. By the middle of the decade, Joe had stopped delivering bread. The bakery's back room had turned into a meeting place for men who no longer spoke of flour but of shipments, routes, and territories. Trucks rolled out at night carrying barrels labeled vinegar and olive oil, but the smell was unmistakable. It was whiskey from Canada, rum from the Caribbean, gin from private stills upstate. Bonanno's boss was no longer the baker. It was the men behind the curtain, men like Masseria. The newspapers called him the boss of bosses. The police called him a myth. But those who lived under his shadow knew better. Masseria ruled by fear wrapped in charm. He gave gifts to the poor on Christmas and bullets to his enemies in spring. His handshake could mean profit or death depending on the day. He was not educated, not graceful, not even particularly clever, but he understood something few others did. Power belonged to those who never apologized for taking it. Joe Bonanno watched from the edges. He never joined the inner circle. He was too quiet for that. But his silence drew attention. Men began to trust him, to use him as a messenger, then as a driver, then as a negotiator. He spoke little, listened much, and always remembered who owed what to whom. In a world built on lies that made him valuable. Meanwhile, Masseria's empire grew restless. Other Sicilian factions, the ones from Castellamare del Golfo, believed the old man had grown greedy and sloppy. He demanded tribute from everyone, even those who owed him nothing. His soldiers were loyal only because they feared him. And fear, as Joe Bonanno had learned as a boy, burns fast and dies faster. Whispers spread through the streets. Masseria's time is ending. But no one dared say it aloud. One night, at a smoky club in Manhattan, Joe saw it for himself. Masseria sat at a poker table, surrounded by laughter that wasn't real. His fingers were thick with rings, his glass filled with imported scotch. A violin played somewhere in the corner, soft and mournful. The boss leaned forward, smiling at a young man across the table. A man named Salvatore Maranzano, newly arrived from Sicily, clever, polished, dangerous. Their conversation was cordial, but the air between them felt brittle. Each man wanted the same thing: absolute control. Masseria poured himself another drink and said, "You know, Maranzano, in America, there is only one king." Maranzano's smile didn't reach his eyes. "In Sicily," he replied, "there is only God." The men at the table froze. Then, slowly they laughed, pretending to miss the meaning. But Joe, watching from the shadows, felt the tremor that passed through the room. It was the beginning of something larger, a war that would devour them all. Over the next months, violence returned to New York like an old sickness. Men vanished on their way to work. Restaurants exploded without warning. Bodies floated in the East River. Newspapers printed names that no one dared to say aloud. They called it the Castellamarese War. To the city it was another gangster feud. To men like Bonanno it was a test of survival. Joe kept his head down. He delivered messages, drove cars, and buried secrets. Yet even from the periphery he could see the cracks forming. Masseria no longer trusted anyone. He moved constantly between apartments, surrounded by guards who feared him more than his enemies did. His meals were tasted before he ate. His sleep came in fragments. The king of the underworld had become a prisoner of his own throne. One afternoon, Joe was summoned to deliver an envelope to a restaurant in Coney Island. The instructions were precise: no questions, no detours. When he arrived, he recognized the car parked outside. It belonged to Lucky Luciano, one of Masseria's closest lieutenants. Inside, Luciano was laughing with two men Joe had never seen before. Their laughter stopped when Joe entered. Luciano smiled that polished, dangerous smile and said, "You're early, kid. Good." Joe left the envelope and walked away, but something in his stomach twisted. Behind him, the door closed. The sound was soft, final. That night, word spread across every corner of Little Italy: Joe the boss was dead. They found him face down at the poker table, half a plate of spaghetti still steaming beside his hand. 4 bullets had turned his dinner into confession. No one claimed credit. No one mourned publicly. But every man in the city understood what it meant. The old world had fallen. The game had changed. Joe Bonanno walked the streets that night under a light rain, the lamps reflecting like gold coins in the puddles. The city felt strangely quiet, as if holding its breath. Somewhere, a violin played the same mournful tune he'd heard at that poker table months ago. He stopped, listened, and realized that for the first time in his life he wasn't just watching history. He was standing inside it. The boy from Sicily had crossed an ocean and a lifetime to reach this moment. The smoke of his childhood had followed him here, curling around every street corner, every alleyway, every whispered deal. Power, he thought, always smells like fire before it burns. He buttoned his coat, turned toward the east, and walked on. The wind that came off the Atlantic that afternoon was sharp enough to slice through a man's coat. It carried salt, grit, and the faint metallic scent of the boardwalk railings at Coney Island. Inside a small seaside restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro, the tables were already set for lunch. White linens, polished silver, a vase of tired carnations near the window. The city outside moved in its usual rhythm. Streetcars rattling, seagulls crying, vendors calling. No one noticed the dark Packard that pulled up to the curb, or the man who stepped out of it adjusting his hat against the wind. Joe, the boss Masseria, hated the ocean. He said it reminded him of Sicily, of things he preferred not to remember. But today he had agreed to eat by the water. Lucky Luciano had insisted. "A quiet place, boss," he had said that morning. "No one'll bother us. Just cards, wine, and a good meal." Masseria, weary from too many sleepless nights and too many rumors, had finally relented. The war with Maranzano was bleeding him dry. He needed to show his men that he was still strong, still calm, still the king. A simple lunch, he told himself. A show of peace. Luciano arrived first. He was dressed like a banker, gray suit, silk tie, clean shave, not a hint of gunpowder anywhere on him. He greeted the owner with a nod, ordered Chianti, and asked for the private room near the back. By noon, the boss arrived, surrounded by 2 bodyguards who hovered at the door like shadows. Masseria removed his coat, tossed his hat on the table, and let Luciano pour him wine. "Looks good here," Masseria said, glancing around the room. "You pick nice places, Charlie." Luciano smiled. "You deserve it, boss. After all, you built this city." Masseria laughed, though it came out more like a cough. He looked older than his years, his hands swollen, his eyes rimmed with red. "I built it," he said, "but it don't listen no more." They played cards. They ate oysters and pasta with clams. Luciano joked about the police raids uptown, about how the feds couldn't tell olive oil from bootleg rum. Masseria laughed again, but his laughter had no sound. He watched the younger man shuffle the deck, quick and neat. There was something about Luciano's ease that unnerved him. Power made men tense, not relaxed. Unless, of course, the man already knew the ending of the story. Outside, the wind grew stronger. The curtains by the window lifted and fell like slow breaths. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. When the dessert arrived, Masseria leaned back in his chair and wiped his hands on the linen napkin. "So," he said, "this Maranzano. You talked to him?" Luciano's smile didn't change. "Once or twice. He thinks you'll never give up your seat." Masseria's eyebrows rose. "And what do you think, Charlie?" Luciano poured himself more wine. "I think the old ways die hard." Masseria nodded. "Then let them die standing." He reached for his cigarette case. Luciano watched him strike the match. The flame flickered, reflected briefly in the silverware, then went out. "I'll be right back," Luciano said quietly, pushing back his chair. He stepped through the side door into the narrow hallway that led to the kitchen. The cooks looked up as he passed. He nodded once. Then he opened the back door. A gust of cold air swept in, along with 3 men in overcoats. They moved fast, silent, practiced. Luciano didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He simply walked to the end of the hall and lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly as the door closed behind him. Inside the dining room, Joe Masseria was studying his cards when the first shot broke the silence. He looked up, confused as the second and third hit him in the chest. The plate shattered on the floor. His wine glass fell, staining the linen a deep red. By the time the 4th shot came, the boss of bosses was already gone. When Luciano returned, the air smelled of cordite and Chianti. He didn't look at the body. He simply picked up his coat, nodded to the owner, and left a $50 bill on the table. Outside, the seagulls had returned, screaming above the boardwalk. The tide was coming in. News spread before nightfall. The newspapers called it the end of an era. The streets of Little Italy whispered the same sentence in a dozen dialects. "Joe the boss is dead." Some said Maranzano had ordered it. Others said Luciano himself had pulled the trigger. But those who truly understood the game knew better. This wasn't murder. It was evolution. That night, the rain came down hard, drumming against the windows of every tenement in Brooklyn. Joe Bonanno sat alone in his small apartment, reading the paper by the dim light of a single bulb. The headline was brief, almost respectful. "Gang leader slain in Coney Island restaurant." No names of suspects. No arrests. Just a photograph of the boarded-up door and a single shoe lying in a puddle. Bonanno read the words twice, then folded the paper carefully and placed it on the table. He poured himself a glass of red wine, took a slow sip, and stared out the window. Lightning flashed over the river, white and distant. Somewhere in that light, he imagined the face of the man who had ruled the city for a decade. He thought of the bakery, of that first meeting, of the heavy voice that once told him, "A boy who works is a boy who lives." The boss was gone, and yet the city outside pulsed with new life. The streets were open now. The throne empty. Bonanno finished the wine, set the glass down, and whispered to no one, "In America, even kings don't die quietly." Down below, the wind carried the smell of rain and gasoline. A streetcar clanged its way toward the bridge. Somewhere far off, a church bell rang 13 times, one more than it should have. In that sound, Joe Bonanno heard both an ending and a beginning. The old world had been buried that afternoon by the sea. The new one was already writing its first commandment: never trust the man pouring your wine. The rain that fell after Masseria's death washed the city clean, but it could not wash away the blood that had soaked into its cobblestones. Every street in Little Italy whispered his name that spring, and every whisper ended the same way, with silence. Joe Bonanno had lived long enough to know that silence was how power survived. The newspapers called it the end of the old guard. In bars and barber shops, men spoke of Lucky Luciano with reverence and fear. But in the narrow alleys of Brooklyn, among the Sicilians from Castellamare del Golfo, another name began to rise, a man older, quieter, more devout, and infinitely more dangerous. His name was Salvatore Maranzano. To Joe Bonanno, the name sounded like history waking from its sleep. Maranzano summoned him for the first time on a gray afternoon in 1931. The meeting took place in a small apartment above a delicatessen on Knickerbocker Avenue. There were no guards, no guns on the table, no raised voices. Just Maranzano in a dark suit, a gold crucifix gleaming at his throat, and the faint smell of anise from the pastries downstairs. Bonanno stood respectfully until the older man gestured to a chair. "You are from Castellamare," Maranzano said in Italian. "Yes," Joe answered. "Then you are family." Maranzano poured 2 glasses of wine. "America is changing, my son. These young ones, they think money is the only law. Luciano, Lansky, Costello, they would sell their souls for a nickel. But we remember who we are. Honor, silence, loyalty. That is the old way. That is our way." He handed the wine to Joe and smiled. "I hear you are patient. The patient man inherits what the loud man loses." Joe drank slowly. The wine was sweet and heavy, like something meant to seal a promise. By the time he left that apartment, he was no longer the boy who baked bread. He was part of something older than America itself. A brotherhood with no flag, no borders, no forgiveness. Over the next months, Bonanno became Maranzano's quiet shadow. He carried messages, arranged meetings, and learned to read the new map of the city, the one not drawn on paper but on fear. Maranzano was reorganizing everything. He divided the city into territories, 5 of them each ruled by a family. No more chaos. No more small wars. It was structure born from blood. And when the list of names was complete, Joe Bonanno's was among them. The youngest consigliere in the history of the Cosa Nostra. But peace, as always, was temporary. Luciano, clever and modern, had no patience for Maranzano's Roman fantasies. He called him Caesar, and the word was not meant kindly. Maranzano's sermons about ancient discipline clashed with Luciano's hunger for business. The streets buzzed again with rumors: 2 kings, 1 throne. Joe heard the whispers in every barber shop, every restaurant, every late-night telephone call that ended with a long silence. He watched his mentor grow more paranoid, surrounding himself with guards, inspecting visitors for weapons, speaking only through intermediaries. The old world, Bonanno realized, never truly trusted the new. One afternoon, Maranzano took him aside. They were standing near a window, the city humming far below. "You are loyal, Giuseppe," the old man said. "When the others forget, you remember. Something happens to me, keep the family pure. Promise me that." "I promise," Joe said. A week later, Maranzano was dead. 6 men entered his office pretending to be IRS agents. They carried briefcases and pistols. When they left, Caesar was on the floor with 6 holes in his chest and 1 in his throat. The empire of order ended in 15 seconds. That night, the city held its breath again. The 5 families remained, but the Roman was gone, and the throne he built now waited for someone calm enough to sit on it without trembling. Joe Bonanno did not celebrate. He stayed in his apartment, lights off, listening to the sound of distant sirens. He understood that every empire began with a death and that the man who looked too eager to replace the dead was usually next to follow. Instead, he waited. He kept working, kept quiet, kept breathing. Within a year, the Bonanno family had begun to form around him. Not declared, not written, not even spoken at first, just understood. Men came to him for advice. Disputes were settled in his kitchen. He took no money from prostitutes or drugs, only from gambling and protection. Respectable crime, he called it. A contradiction only men like him could believe in. By the time he was 30, Joe Bonanno was not merely a name whispered in corners. He was Don Giuseppe. He dressed modestly, spoke softly, and prayed often. But those who mistook kindness for weakness did not live long. He had inherited the Sicilian code from his father. When a man cannot defend his bread, he does not deserve to eat it. And in New York, bread meant territory. Bread meant silence. Bread meant survival. His wife, Faye, an American girl with dark eyes, asked him once, "Do you ever wish you had stayed in Sicily?" Joe smiled faintly. "Sicily came with me," he said. They had children, Bill and Catherine, and for a time, it seemed the Bonanno world might truly live in peace. Joe built businesses. Trucking, construction, a few restaurants that actually served food. The family expanded quietly through the boroughs, their influence invisible yet everywhere. When problems arose, Joe solved them not with bullets but with dinners, with envelopes, with the slow, deliberate patience of a man who had seen entire empires collapse from greed. He met with Luciano once after the war. They talked of boundaries, of mutual benefit, of the future. "You're old school," Luciano told him, lighting a cigarette. "But maybe the world still needs a little of that." Joe nodded. "Every building needs a foundation," he said. And that was how it stayed for years. The quiet dawn of Queens, the last of the traditionalists, the ghost who ruled without raising his voice. While others sought fame, he sought longevity. He believed that true power was not in making men fear you but in making them obey you without remembering why. Sometimes, late at night, he would walk alone through the city he had conquered without declaring war. The streets had changed, brighter, faster, louder, but the air still smelled faintly of the sea. He would stop beneath the old bakery sign on Grand Street, long closed, and imagine the boy he once was, covered in flour, watching powerful men through the crack of a door. He wondered if that boy would recognize the man he had become. In the distance, a siren wailed, fading toward the river. Joe Bonanno adjusted his coat, turned toward the glow of Manhattan, and kept walking. The rain began to fall, thin and cold. It reminded him of that night in Sicily so many years ago, the smell of burning vines and the sound of his father's voice. When a man cannot defend his bread, he does not deserve to eat it. Tonight he thought he had defended more than bread. He had defended an idea, a way of life. And for now the city slept under his protection. Chicago smelled of ambition and gunpowder. It was the kind of city that didn't sleep, it prowled. At night, the smoke from the stockyards mixed with the perfume of Lake Michigan until the air itself seemed restless. Streetcars clattered, horns wailed, and under the yellow glow of electric lamps, deals were made that would never appear on paper. In 1926, a young man named Anthony Accardo walked those streets with a calm that unsettled everyone who noticed him. He wasn't tall, wasn't loud, didn't have the violent charm of his boss, Al Capone. He was just a kid with dark eyes, slick hair, and a talent for disappearing in plain sight. He carried himself like someone who had already decided to live longer than the rest. They called him Joe Batters First, after he beat two rival gangsters to death with a baseball bat during dinner. Capone laughed so hard he nearly choked. "This kid's a real Joe Batters," he said, and the name stuck for a while. But years later, when Accardo ruled the outfit in silence, they would call him something else. The Big Tuna, after the enormous fish he caught off California, a joke that hid how dangerous he truly was. Accardo began as muscle. Chicago in those days was a war zone dressed in suits. North Side versus South Side, Irish against Italian, blood soaking the snow every winter. Capone's men ran liquor by truck from Canada, guarded by machine guns. Every week, bodies floated in the river like unwanted cargo. Accardo's job was simple: make problems disappear. He didn't talk much, didn't drink, didn't gamble. When others chased fame, he chased efficiency. Capone noticed. He liked that the boy never bragged, never hesitated, never smiled when someone died. "You're a smart one," Capone told him once. "Someday you'll run the whole goddamn city." Accardo just nodded. "Maybe," he said. "If the city's still worth running." When Capone fell, crushed by the weight of taxes and syphilis, the outfit didn't collapse. It changed shape. Frank Nitti took the reins first, then Paul Ricca, and behind them both, quietly taking notes, was Tony Accardo. He learned that survival wasn't about pulling the trigger, it was about knowing when not to. Chicago had no patience for cowboys. It rewarded ghosts. By the 1940s, Accardo controlled the gambling circuits, the unions, and 1,000 small enterprises that looked clean on paper. He had discovered something the New York families hadn't yet mastered: legitimacy. Where others built empires on blood, he built his on ledgers. A man who pays taxes, he once said, never gets raided. He dressed simply, lived modestly in a stone house on the outskirts of River Forest, and mowed his own lawn on Sundays. Neighbors called him Mr. Accardo, never suspecting that their quiet, polite friend controlled half the city's underworld. When he walked to church with his wife, children trailing behind, he looked like an accountant, not an emperor. But when someone crossed him, the quiet ended. In 1946, a group of thieves broke into his home while he was vacationing in Florida. They stole jewelry, cash, even his wife's fur coats. The police never found them, but over the next 2 weeks, 7 bodies appeared across Chicago. One was found in a car trunk, another in an alley, another in the river with his fingers broken. No one ever spoke of the robbery again. When a reporter asked Accardo if he knew anything about it, he smiled politely. "Only that crime doesn't pay," he said. He rarely raised his voice, yet his orders were carried out with almost religious devotion. He preferred logic over rage. He replaced machine guns with contracts, extortion with ownership. Casinos in Las Vegas paid him quietly. So did unions, restaurants, trucking companies, and movie distributors. He had turned the outfit into a business, one that made millions without leaving fingerprints. Even the New York Dons respected him. Bonanno once called him, "the last man who understands both worlds, the gun and the pen." When they met in Chicago in the early 50s, the two spoke like old priests discussing scripture. "We've both survived too much," Bonanno said. "Maybe that's our punishment." Accardo smiled faintly. "No, Joe. It's our advantage." He ruled for decades without stepping inside a courtroom. He never drank in public, never gambled in front of witnesses, never took photographs he didn't approve. Reporters called him the ghost who mowed his own lawn. To the FBI he was untouchable. His tax returns were immaculate. His handwriting perfect. His record clean. But in backrooms, men whispered that every quiet order from River Forest carried the weight of 10 guns. By the 1970s, Accardo had become legend. New faces ran the streets, new wars flared and died, but the big Tuna remained untouched. He was older, slower, yet sharper than ever. He spent his mornings feeding birds on his porch, reading newspapers, and laughing at the politicians who called themselves powerful. When asked once how he had managed to survive so long, he answered without hesitation, "I learned to talk like a businessman and think like a priest. Everyone sins, kid. I just don't confess." In 1978, his house was robbed again. This time, the thieves were ambitious young criminals who thought the old man had softened. 2 weeks later, 6 of them were dead. One was found in a dumpster behind a bar. Another had vanished entirely. The police shrugged, reporters speculated, but no one doubted who had spoken. The message was simple and eternal: respect never retires. In his final years, Accardo withdrew from public life entirely. He spent his afternoons fishing, his evenings listening to Sinatra, his nights staring at the dark water that had carried him through half a century of blood and profit. His empire ran itself, clean, efficient, invisible. He had lived to see every rival buried, every prosecutor outlasted. The big Tuna had never spent a night in jail. Not one. When he died in 1992, they found him asleep in his recliner, television still on, slippers neatly placed beside him. The obituary called him a retired businessman. The FBI called him the last of the untouchables. And somewhere, perhaps in the restless wind off Lake Michigan, the city whispered his epitaph. He left no fingerprints, only ghosts. New York was changing again. The skyline glittered brighter, the suits grew sharper, but underneath the glass towers, the old loyalties were cracking like thin ice. For decades, Joe Bonanno had ruled quietly, a man of manners and control, while the younger generation burned their money in nightclubs and talked too much into telephones. By 1963, the world that once worshipped silence had forgotten how to keep it. They called it progress. Bonanno called it noise. He was 60 now, his hair silver, his eyes still dark and watchful. He lived in a modest house in Hempstead, Long Island, away from the chaos of Manhattan. His mornings began with espresso, the newspaper, and a phone call from one of his lieutenants. His afternoons were filled with meetings, family dinners, small business deals. To outsiders he looked like a retired gentleman. To insiders he was still Don Giuseppe, the last of the old Dons, a remnant of honor in a city drowning in ambition. But peace in the underworld never lasts long. It only waits. The trouble began with a whisper, that Bonanno had grown weak, that he no longer understood the world he ruled. Younger captains grumbled that he was old-fashioned, too careful, too slow. They wanted faster money, bigger rackets, less restraint. And behind that whisper stood one man, Gaspar Di Gregorio, once Bonanno's loyal soldier, now a rival with a smile that never reached his eyes. Di Gregorio was everything Joe distrusted. American-born, reckless, addicted to attention. He drove Cadillacs with fins, wore diamond pinky rings, and spoke to reporters like they were his friends. He told anyone who would listen that he could modernize the family, bring it into the new era. The commission, the ruling body of the 5 families, listened. When they realized that Bonanno had refused to attend their meetings for months, they decided the family needed a new leader. Di Gregorio's moment had come. Bonanno read the news like a man reading his own death notice. The commission had officially recognized Di Gregorio as acting boss. It was treason, legal treason, the kind sanctioned by men in better suits. That evening he sat in his study, the lights low, a cigarette burning in the ashtray. His son Bill stood by the window, restless, angry, young. "They think you're finished, Pop," he said. Bonanno exhaled smoke slowly. "They think too much." "You can't let him take it," Bill pressed. "You taught these men. You fed their families." "I did," Joe said quietly, "and now they want more. That's the curse of feeding men, they forget who cooked." The newspapers would later call it the Banana War, a name that made it sound almost comical, as if it were fought with fruit instead of bullets. But those who lived through it knew better. It was not a war of streets, but of silence. Not of gunfire, but of empty chairs and unreturned phone calls. At first, Bonanno refused to retaliate. He believed time would remind them of who he was. But then one night, a car bomb exploded outside his lieutenant's home in Queens. 2 days later, another ally disappeared. Then came the message, a folded newspaper delivered to Joe's door, the headline circled in red, "New boss installed by commission." He folded it again calmly and set it beside his coffee. "So," he murmured, "it begins." For years, Bonanno had built his empire on discipline. Now he was forced to fight the very thing he had created. He didn't trust the police, never had, but he trusted the streets, and the streets were speaking. Everyone wanted to know who would break first, the loyalists or the reformers. No one realized that the real fracture wasn't between them, it was inside Joe himself. The war never looked like a war. It looked like accidents, bad luck, sudden illness. It was men shot in cars, businesses burned, families relocated overnight. It was whispered alliances, midnight meetings in basements, and the slow unraveling of everything Bonanno had built with patience and fear. One evening in 1965, Bonanno was walking toward his car after a dinner meeting in Brooklyn when 2 men stepped out of the dark. One of them called his name. The next thing he remembered was the smell of damp cloth over his face and the sound of tires on asphalt. He woke hours later in a strange house upstate, his head pounding. The papers called it an abduction. The commission called it retirement. Bonanno called it a warning from the new world. When he finally returned to the city months later, nothing was the same. Di Gregorio controlled the streets. The commission had stopped returning his calls. Even his oldest friends crossed the street to avoid him. And his son Bill, passionate, loyal, reckless, was now a marked man. Bonanno understood, perhaps too late, that wars were no longer fought with respect. They were fought with headlines, lawyers, and microphones. The old code was dying, and he was dying with it. The final confrontation came on a cold December night. Bill Bonanno and a group of loyalists gathered in a Brooklyn basement. Across the street, Di Gregorio's men waited in silence, rifles hidden beneath their coats. Someone made the first move, no one remembers who, and the air filled with the echo of gunfire. When the smoke cleared, the street was empty again. No bodies were found, but something in the city's air had changed forever. The papers called it the Troutman Street shootout. The families called it an embarrassment. Joe Bonanno called it destiny. He withdrew after that. First from New York, then from business, then from the world. He moved to Arizona, to a quiet house under the desert sun, where the only sound was wind moving through the cactus. There, surrounded by sand and silence, he began to write. The book was called A Man of Honor. It was his confession, his defense, his elegy. In its pages, he claimed to be no criminal at all, merely a man living by the old rules in a new, dishonorable world. Sometimes he would sit outside at dusk, the desert sky turning gold, and remember the smell of his father's burning vineyard, the words that had followed him across an ocean. When a man cannot defend his bread, he does not deserve to eat it. Now he thought he had defended it too long. Maybe it was time to stop eating altogether. The war of the bananas had ended not with victory or defeat, but with silence. And for a man like Joe Bonanno, silence had always been the truest form of power. The desert was supposed to be his peace. After 40 years in the shadows of New York, Joe Bonanno thought Arizona would wash him clean. No more sirens, no more whispers, no more blood on marble floors. Just sun, silence, and time. But power is a disease that doesn't leave the body quietly. It lingers in the nerves, the breath, the memory. He bought a small stucco house outside Tucson, white walls fading under the sun, a lemon tree in the yard. The mountains beyond looked carved from glass. Each morning he rose early, brewed thick espresso, and sat on the porch in a wicker chair. The air tasted of dust and sage. Sometimes he heard coyotes in the distance. Sometimes he heard voices that weren't there, echoes from basements, bars, and back rooms where he'd spent half his life pretending to be untouchable. He told everyone he had retired. To the world he was a man of 70, a grandfather, a businessman resting in the desert warmth. But his phone still rang. The old contacts never stopped calling: Chicago, Las Vegas, Montreal, even New York. They still asked for favors, for advice, for arbitration. The empire refused to believe he had abdicated. To them, Don Giuseppe was eternal. His son Bill visited often, full of restless energy. He had inherited his father's will but none of his patience. "You should have fought harder," he would say. "You let them take everything." Joe would just shake his head. "You don't keep power by fighting, Bill. You keep it by knowing when the fight is over." Bill never understood. He was born American. His father was born Sicilian. The blood was the same, but the temperature was different. They would sit together in the evenings, watching the desert fade into violet. The horizon seemed infinite, but to Joe it looked like a grave that had forgotten its name. He sometimes caught himself thinking of Brooklyn, the way rain used to sound against tenement roofs, the smell of bread from the old bakery. Nostalgia, he thought, was the last sin of a tired man. Then, one summer afternoon, betrayal found him again. It arrived not with gunfire, but with ink. In July 1968, an FBI subpoena landed on his doorstep. A thick envelope, official and cold. The Bureau had decided that the desert was not far enough to hide from history. They wanted him in court, to testify about his years in New York, about the families, the rackets, the commission. To them, he was no longer the quiet old man in retirement. He was the last living map of the American Mafia. He sat at the table, the papers spread before him, the air still. To most men it would have looked like defeat. To Bonanno it looked familiar. Every empire ends with a piece of paper. Bill was furious. "You can't go," he said. "They'll humiliate you. You taught them everything and now they want to put you on display." Joe looked up, his expression unreadable. "I will not give them what they want," he said softly. "I will give them nothing." But that was a lie. He went. He stood before the court, thin and composed, answering questions in a voice so calm it frightened the prosecutors. When they accused him of leading a criminal empire, he smiled faintly. "An empire?" he said. "I built a family. If you don't understand the difference, that is your problem, not mine." He walked out of the courtroom untouched, but the damage was done. The myth of Don Giuseppe had cracked under the fluorescent lights of justice. The newspapers mocked him, the commission erased him, and even the loyal ones began to call less often. For the first time in his life, Joe Bonanno was truly alone. That winter, a heart attack struck him while he was pruning the lemon tree. He survived, but something in him didn't. He began to forget names, dates, even the faces of old friends. He spent afternoons on the porch, staring into the heat waves, his rosary beads slipping through his fingers. The sun pressed on him like judgment. It was during one of those long, silent evenings that Bill arrived with a bottle of red wine and bad news. "They're talking about you again," he said. "The commission. They think you'll talk to the feds." Joe chuckled softly. "After all these years? I've said nothing since I was 9 years old. You think I'll start now?" But Bill didn't laugh. "They don't believe silence anymore, Pop. They believe tape recorders." Bonanno turned his gaze toward the horizon. The sun was setting behind the mountains, burning them into gold. "Then maybe it's time," he said. "Time for what?" "For them to forget me completely." Within a month he was gone. No note, no warning. The newspapers speculated, the FBI searched, even the family wondered. Some said he'd been kidnapped again. Others whispered he had vanished into Mexico under another name. In truth, he was hiding in plain sight in a friend's guest house outside Phoenix. He read, prayed, and listened to the radio, letting the world believe what it wanted. When he returned a year later, older and quieter, he found that the world had indeed moved on. The old families had splintered. The city no longer feared the names that once ruled it. Casinos had replaced neighborhoods. Lawyers had replaced soldiers. The new dons wore cufflinks instead of crucifixes. He visited New York only once after that. It was autumn. The trees in Central Park were red and gold. He walked slowly through the streets he once owned and recognized nothing. The bakery was gone, the church boarded up, the faces foreign. At a cafe on Mulberry Street, He ordered espresso and watched a group of young men in silk suits laugh too loudly. They were gangsters, he could tell. But they had no shadows. On the flight back to Arizona, he looked down at the city lights and thought of the long line of ghosts trailing behind him. Masseria, Maranzano, Luciano, Accardo, all of them brilliant, all of them dead. He had outlived them all, but what was left to outlive? He arrived home at midnight. The air was cool, the stars sharp as glass. Bill was waiting at the porch with 2 glasses of wine. "Did you find what you were looking for?" his son asked. Joe smiled faintly. "I was looking for silence," he said, "and I found too much of it." They drank without speaking. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistled, a long, low sound that seemed to carry every memory he had ever buried. Later, when Bill went inside, Joe stayed on the porch, staring at the horizon. He thought of Sicily, of smoke rising from vineyards, of the ship that brought him across the ocean. He thought of all the men who had sworn loyalty and then vanished. And he thought of the lesson he had carried his whole life, that the world doesn't reward kindness or cruelty, it rewards whoever can endure the longest. The desert was silent except for the wind. He closed his eyes, let the heat wash over him, and whispered one last truth, too soft for anyone to hear. Power doesn't die. It only changes its name. By the mid-1970s, Chicago had grown slick and bright, a city that liked to pretend it had forgotten the blood beneath its asphalt. The world was obsessed with new gods, money, fame, politics, and no one seemed to notice that a single old man in River Forest still pulled invisible strings. His name was Anthony Accardo. The police called him retired. The city called him respectable. But inside every shadowed boardroom, men still lowered their voices when they said his name. The big Tuna had not disappeared. He had merely learned to breathe underwater. Accardo's house sat at the end of a quiet suburban street lined with maple trees. The lawn was perfect. The porch light never flickered. Neighbors waved when he mowed the grass himself, never suspecting that the man who trimmed his own hedges had once decided who lived and died in Chicago. His wife, Clarice, tended the garden. His children went to Catholic schools. It looked like a postcard. It was camouflage. Every morning, he rose before sunrise, read the Chicago Tribune, and walked to the end of his driveway for the mail. He smiled at the postman, tipped the garbage collectors, and never spoke above a whisper. He paid taxes on time, donated to churches, attended charity dinners. To the government he was a retired beer distributor. To the underworld he was the final arbiter, the old priest of power who could end arguments with a nod. When his protégés visited, they came in twos, never staying long. They brought envelopes, reports, names. He listened, rarely spoke, and sent them away lighter or heavier depending on what he'd heard. His empire was no longer built on bootleg whiskey or dice games, it was built on companies, unions, and casinos. Paperwork instead of pistols. In the modern age, crime had gone corporate, and Accardo had been the first to see it coming. He called it progress with manners. The young men who replaced him were loud, flashy suits, shiny cars, gold chains. They liked attention. Accardo hated attention. He told them once, a smart man lets others take the credit. And the blame. Most of them ignored the advice. Most of them ended up in prison. His rule was invisible but absolute. Everyone in the outfit, from bookie to boss, knew the unspoken law. You could take your chances anywhere but with Accardo's piece. If you crossed him, there would be no warnings, no shouting, no witnesses. The city would simply rearrange itself and you would no longer be in it. That truth returned in 1978. While the old man was away in California, thieves broke into his house. They ransacked the rooms, stole jewelry, cash, and the family silver. The police arrived, took statements, and promised to investigate. Accardo thanked them politely. Then he made a single phone call. Over the next 2 weeks, 6 men were found dead. 1 shot in a parking lot. Another beaten beyond recognition. 2 disappeared completely. The message was so clear that it didn't need words. Some lines remained sacred, even when drawn by an old man's hand. Reporters asked him about it afterward. Accardo smiled for the cameras, his face lined and calm. "I don't know what people are talking about," he said. "I'm just an old man who loves his home." Behind him, Chicago nodded and pretended to believe it. Years passed. Presidents came and went. The mob lost its glamour. Television turned gangsters into myths, but the real ones, like Accardo, faded into rumor. The FBI still watched him, of course they always had, but their files grew dusty. He never slipped. Not once. No wiretap, no witness, no conviction. To them he was a riddle that refused to end. In his quiet years he fished. He liked the stillness of the lake, the way the water held no judgment. Sometimes, sitting in the boat with the line drifting below the surface, he would think of Capone, of Ricca, of the old faces long gone. He thought of Joe Bonanno too, the Sicilian philosopher of New York, now fading in the desert. They had both survived by staying small while their empires grew enormous. He rarely spoke of the past, but once to his grandson he said, "Power is like smoke. You can't hold it, but it marks everything it touches." The boy didn't understand. Accardo didn't expect him to. The new world no longer cared about omerta or loyalty. Cared about fame. The last true act of power in his life came quietly, the way everything else did. In 1986, a young lieutenant made the mistake of bragging to a reporter about the old man. Within a week, the reporter recanted, the lieutenant resigned, and the story vanished. No one asked how. Accardo's peace returned unbroken. He began spending more time indoors. His hands trembled now when he held his coffee cup. The neighbors said he was aging gracefully. The FBI called it waiting. But inside his head, the empire still existed, casinos humming, envelopes changing hands, Chicago gleaming like a kingdom that had never stopped paying its tithes. On summer nights he would sit on his porch and listen to the cicadas. The sound reminded him of machine guns from long ago, quick, rhythmic, merciless. He smiled at the thought. The noise had followed him his whole life, from the alleys of the Capone years to this suburban silence. Maybe that was the price of power, to always hear the echo of what you'd done even after the world forgot. When his wife asked once if he was happy, he looked out at the dark trees and said, "Happiness is for amateurs." He died in 1992, sitting in his recliner, the television glowing blue against his face. The obituary called him a retired businessman. No one mentioned the wars he'd ended or the men he'd buried. But Chicago remembered. You could still feel him in the rhythm of the city, in the careful politeness of its businessmen, in the quiet menace behind certain smiles. And somewhere far away under the Arizona sun, Joe Bonanno was still alive, reading the papers, shaking his head. He knew what the headline meant. Another ghost joining the congregation. The era of noise was over. What remained was silence, perfect, disciplined, eternal. By the time the last of the old dons had drifted into the quiet corners of memory, their children had grown up under different lights, fluorescent, merciless, American. The names that had once commanded fear now drew curiosity or pity. The newspapers had stopped printing them in bold. The city had new kings, CEOs, politicians, television hosts. But blood, like smoke, never truly clears. Bill Bonanno stood at his father's funeral in Tucson in 2002, the desert wind flapping the black cloth of the tent. The crowd was small, family, a few gray men from New York, priests, curious reporters. He had seen hundreds of funerals in his time, some lavish, some rushed, all marked by the same unease. The living never knew how much of themselves they were burying. When the prayers ended, he watched the casket descend into the earth and thought of Sicily, of a vineyard burned long before his own birth. The earth keeps secrets better than any man, he thought. After the service, a young reporter approached him. "Mr. Bonanno," she said, "how does it feel to be the son of a legend?" He smiled, slow and weary. "You call it legend," he said. "We called it survival." She waited for more, but he said nothing. The Bonanno men had learned early that every word was a kind of surrender. That night, back in his small apartment, Bill poured a drink and turned on the television. A documentary was playing, grainy footage of his father, black and white, solemn. The narrator's voice spoke of honor among thieves, of codes and betrayals. He turned the sound down. His reflection stared at him in the darkened screen. He wondered if his sons would ever truly understand who they were, or whether it was better if they didn't. Across the country in Chicago, another funeral had come and gone a decade earlier. Anthony Accardo had left behind children who lived like royalty but spoke of him as if he were folklore. One of his grandsons, a lawyer now, liked to tell friends that the old man had once run half the city. The friends would laugh, thinking it a joke. It was safer that way. In their house, framed photos of the big Tuna showed him smiling on fishing trips, the perfect American patriarch. There were no photos of the men who had died for him. But sometimes at night, when the grandson drove through River Forest, he swore he could feel eyes in the dark between the trees, watchful, approving, gone. In Brooklyn, the Masseria name had evaporated completely. No sons, no heirs, just stories told in restaurants and whispered over espresso cups. Joe the boss, they would say, shaking their heads. He was the last of a kind. Every few years, some young hustler would claim to be a distant cousin, waving tattoos and old photographs as proof. The city humored them. The real blood was dust by now. Yet in a way all of them still lived. The banks, the casinos, the construction companies, these were the bones of the empires they'd built. Their money had been washed, pressed, and laundered into respectability. It paid for skyscrapers and universities, for campaigns and cathedrals. The descendants of the men who once whispered in alleys now spoke openly on television about family business, though they meant it differently. Civilization had learned to love the things it used to condemn. One winter evening, Bill Bonanno visited New York for the first time in 20 years. He walked through Little Italy, or what was left of it. The bakeries were tourist traps now, the old apartments turned into boutique hotels. He passed a souvenir shop selling t-shirts with pictures of Marlon Brando and Al Pacino. The Godfather, the sign read, "Respect, Loyalty, Family." He almost laughed. The actors had become the saints of a religion built from misunderstanding. He stopped at a corner cafe and ordered espresso. The waiter, young and careless, asked for his name. "Bonanno," Bill said without thinking. The boy froze for a moment, uncertain if it was a joke. Then he nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. The sound of rain began against the window, soft, persistent. The smell of coffee filled the air. Bill closed his eyes and thought of his father again, of long car rides through Brooklyn, of whispered lessons about patience and pride. When the espresso came, he lifted the cup, tasted it, and whispered to himself, "Still bitter." Across the country in Chicago, one of Accardo's grandsons sat in his office downtown, the skyline glittering behind him. He had built a company from nothing, perfectly legal, perfectly clean. But in the still moments between meetings, he found himself wondering whether his calm came from talent or inheritance. Once, during a merger negotiation, an executive refused his offer. He didn't threaten or raise his voice. He simply looked at the man for a long, silent minute until the other one shifted in his chair. By the end of the day, the deal was signed. That night, he laughed alone in his office, the sound quiet and strangely familiar. "Maybe it's in the blood," he said. "Legacy," Bonanno once wrote, "is not what you leave behind. It's what refuses to leave you." In the decades after the old dons died, their stories became lessons for business schools, metaphors for leadership. The word mafia softened into network and family into brand. The underworld had gone corporate, but its heart still beat to the same rhythm: loyalty, ambition, betrayal. The players had traded fedoras for suits, guns for contracts, but the hunger was the same. Sometimes, in the rare moments when the wind blew just right, you could almost hear them, the ghosts of Bonanno, Masseria, and Accardo, still arguing about honor, still dividing invisible cities. The living mistook it for memory, but it was something older, the persistence of power itself. Late one night in Tucson, Bill Bonanno dreamed of his father sitting at the old table under the lemon tree, writing in that careful, deliberate script. In the dream, the old man looked up and said, "You can change your name, but not your blood." Then he smiled, and the paper in front of him caught fire without sound. Bill woke in the dark, the desert wind moving against the window, carrying dust and the faint scent of citrus. He rose, poured a glass of water, and looked out into the night. The horizon glowed faintly under the moon. Somewhere far away a coyote howled. He raised the glass toward the sound, as if toasting an invisible audience. "To the ones who lasted," he whispered, "and to the ones who never stopped trying." The desert gave no answer. It didn't need to. In the silence he could feel them all, the fathers, the sons, the ghosts of power, still moving beneath the surface of the American night. By the late 1970s, the air in America had changed. The old smoke of secrecy was thinning, replaced by the white glare of television cameras. The streets that had once belonged to whispers now belonged to headlines. The government had found a new word to break the underworld apart: RICO. It didn't need bullets. It needed only voices. Agents who had once circled in frustration began to smile. The Mafia's silence, its oldest, most sacred weapon, was crumbling. Men who had sworn to die before speaking now traded loyalty for leniency. 1,000 stories that had once lived behind closed doors spilled out in courtrooms where fluorescent lights hummed like wasps. Joe Bonanno read about it from his armchair in Arizona. His hands trembled slightly when he held the newspaper. Names he recognized appeared in the columns. Soldiers, capos, underbosses, some dead, some testifying. "They are eating themselves," he said quietly. His wife, Faye, looked up from her knitting. "They always do," she said. In Chicago, the FBI was patient. They didn't need to arrest Anthony Accardo anymore. They only needed to close the circle around everyone he had ever touched. His lieutenants were caught in casinos, in unions, in government contracts. Each new arrest loosened another thread of the empire. Reporters called it the quiet collapse. The agents watched Accardo's house day and night, waiting for him to panic, to flee, to call someone he shouldn't. He did none of those things. He simply went fishing. The big Tuna, unbothered, untouchable, fished until the last. When a young agent finally asked his supervisor, "Why does he just sit there?" the older man said, "Because he already won. We just got here too late." In New York, the Bonanno family fractured again. The sons of the old guard were now middle-aged men with lawyers instead of soldiers. The commission trials of the 1980s laid bare everything the public had only guessed. Wiretaps caught voices that once ruled entire boroughs, talking about money, meetings, even jokes. The mystique evaporated. The Dons were no longer ghosts, they were evidence. Bill Bonanno watched it all unfold. He had already done his time, already written his memoirs, already tried to carve a second life out of the ruins. But when he saw the footage on the evening news, men in handcuffs, their faces pale under the flash of cameras, he felt no victory. Only fatigue. "They made a circus," he told a friend. "We lived by rules. Now they sell those rules to tourists." The friend nodded. "That's progress." "Then progress is a cheap suit," Bill said. Even the word mafia began to dissolve, replaced by cleaner terms: organized crime, racketeering, enterprise corruption. Lawyers argued that these were just economic systems gone wrong. Professors wrote books. Movies romanticized the violence into poetry. The myth that the old men had tried to avoid became their legacy. In 1992, when Accardo's death finally made the front page, the coverage was brief, almost respectful. The papers called him the gentleman boss. The reporters were too young to know what the name had once meant. To them, he was just another headline in the slow funeral of a century. When Joe Bonanno died a decade later, he was 97. The obituaries called him the last Don. They spoke of him as a historical curiosity, a relic of another age. They quoted his book, A Man of Honor, the same way they might quote a philosopher. No one remembered the bakery, the fear, the nights of rain in Brooklyn. Time had bleached the story until it looked almost clean. But there were still people who remembered, the quiet men who had carried messages, who had waited in cars, who had survived long enough to know that nothing truly disappears. At a bar in Queens, an old driver lifted a glass and said, "They made us monsters in the movies, but they never understood. We were just men trying not to be eaten." The bartender nodded and poured another. Silence had fallen, but it was not peace. It was the silence of exhaustion, of a century ending, of ghosts watching their reflections fade. In a house in Tucson years after the last trial, Bill Bonanno found one of his father's notebooks. The cover was cracked, the pages filled with neat, slanted handwriting. Inside, among notes about vineyards and prayers, there was a single line written in Italian. "Chi parla troppo mur due volte." He translated it softly to himself. "He who speaks too much dies twice." Bill closed the notebook and set it on the table. Outside, the desert wind moved against the windows. He thought about all the men who had died only once and all the ones, like his father, who had kept dying in memory, in stories, in every retelling. He turned off the lamp. The room went dark. The silence was total. It was the same silence that had begun in Sicily nearly a century ago, carried across an ocean, and spread through cities that had forgotten its language. It was not the fall of the Mafia, he thought. It was the fall of silence itself. Night settles differently over New York now. The noise never stops. The horns, the subways, the constant low thrum of a city that has outgrown its own conscience. But if you walk down Mulberry Street after midnight, past the tourist cafes and the neon facades, you can still find the old ghosts waiting. Not men, not names, just impressions. 3 shapes in the dark, sitting at a table that no longer exists. The first is heavy-set, his shirt sleeves rolled, a cigar glowing like a dying star. Joe the Boss Masseria. He has the kind of smile that once bought loyalty and signed death warrants. He drums his fingers on the table, impatient as ever. "They forgot us, eh?" he mutters. "All these skyscrapers, all this light, and they forgot who built the streets." Across from him sits Joe Bonanno, older, sharper, the desert sun still clinging to his skin. He does not answer immediately. He never did. His hands are folded neatly on the table, a small gold cross hanging from his neck. "They didn't forget," he says finally. "They just changed the names. They still call it business. They still call it family." The third figure, calm and immaculate, lights a cigarette. Tony Accardo. The smoke curls upward in a thin, perfect line. He glances at the other 2, eyes half-lidded. "And they still think they invented it," he says quietly. "Every boardroom, every stock exchange, it's the same game we played, only cleaner suits." For a long moment, the 3 of them sit in silence. Outside, the city moves, Taxis, laughter, rain. Inside, time stands still. Masseria leans back and chuckles. You know what I miss? The noise. The brass bands at the funerals. The sound of shoes running in the alleys. That was life. Not this spreadsheet nonsense. Bonanno smiles faintly. You miss fear. But fear changes shape. You can't kill it. You can only hire it. Accardo exhales smoke, watching it disappear. I miss control, he says. Back then you could measure power. You knew who owed you, who feared you. Now they talk about influence, algorithms, markets. You can't shake hands with an algorithm. Masseria laughs, loud and bitter. Maybe that's why they sleep worse than we ever did. From somewhere far away, a church bell rings, 12 slow chimes, the kind that mark endings. Bonanno looks toward the sound. Do you ever wonder, he asks softly, what it was all for? Accardo stubs out his cigarette. For nothing, he says. For everything. For the feeling that when you walked into a room, the air changed. That's all any man wants. The rest, money, fame, loyalty, they're just the noise that follows. Masseria nods. And what about honor, Bonanno? You were the philosopher. You tell us, does honor survive? Bonanno looks down at his hands. The cross glints once in the dim light. Honor, he says, survives as long as someone still believes it means something. The trouble is, belief costs more than it used to. For a moment, none of them speak. The city hums. The lights flicker. A door creaks open somewhere, though no wind blows. Then, slowly, Bonanno stands. The chair scrapes softly against the floor. He looks at the other two. Time, he says simply. Accardo smiles, faint and distant. Time, he echoes. The one boss we never beat. Masseria raises his cigar in salute. To the last deal, then. Bonanno nods. To the silence that followed. They fade before the words finish echoing, 3 shadows dissolving into the hum of the modern world. The table remains for a moment longer, 3 glasses of wine untouched, their reflections trembling in the dim light. Then it too is gone. Outside, the rain begins again. The streets shine black and endless. Somewhere, a cab splashes through a puddle, headlights cutting across the wet pavement. A young man in a suit hurries past, phone pressed to his ear, talking about margins, partnerships, expansion. He doesn't notice the faint scent of cigar smoke that lingers behind him, or the whisper that drifts through the alley as the storm rolls in. Power fades. Empires crumble. But in the dark, their names still whisper. And if you stand very still, somewhere between the streetlight and the rain, you might hear it, the faint echo of old voices still negotiating in the night. Masseria. Bonanno. Accardo. 3 shadows at a table that no one remembers, still dividing a city that never learned how to forget.